evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, March 27th. U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order to impose 25% tariffs on all automobile imports to the United States next week. But the deep integration of the North American industry has caused confusion about when those duties would impact the Canadian auto sector.
This is the beginning of Liberation Day in America. We're going to take back just some of the money that has been taken from us by people sitting behind this desk or another desk that's not quite as nice, but they have their choice of 7, as you know. And we're going to charge countries for doing business in our country and taking our jobs, taking our wealth, taking a lot of things that they've been taking over the years. They've taken so much out of our country, friend and foe, and frankly, friend has been oftentimes much worse than foe. And this is very modest. What we're going to be doing is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff. We start off with a 2.5% base, which is what we were at, and we go to 25%.
Prime Minister Mark Carney called the move a direct attack on Canadian auto workers.
President Trump announced 25% tariffs against our auto industry. And this is a direct attack, to be clear, a direct attack on the very workers that I stood in front of, uniform workers I stood in front of this morning at the Ambassador Bridge. A bridge that is a symbol and a reality up until now of the tight ties between our two countries, ties of kinship, ties of commerce, ties that are in the process of being broken. We will defend our workers. We will defend our companies. We will defend our country, and we will defend it together.
A fact sheet provided by the White House said that automobiles imported under CUSMA will only be tariffed on the value of content not made in the U.S. This morning, before attending the Canada-U.S. Relations Cabinet meeting, Minister François-Philippe Champagne said that all the tariffs will do is increase costs for Americans.
Minister, after Washington, you were optimistic after your meeting with Howard Lutnick. Did something change? Are you surprised with what has happened?
Well, listen, we're here this morning to fight for Canada, to fight for workers, to fight for industry. What we've seen yesterday, it's going to do two things. It's going to bring the price up for U.S. consumers, and it's going to bring competitiveness down for U.S. industry. So today, it's all about making sure we fight for Canadians. That's what they expect from us.
And this morning, Mr. Trump says that he will deliver tariffs far larger than currently planned against Canada and the European Union if they work together against America. And following Mr. Trump's tariff announcement, Ontario Premier Doug Ford says he's looking to inflict as much pain as possible on the U.S. while sparing Canadians, saying, quote, "We either roll over or we feel a little bit of pain and fight like we've never fought before."
$65 billion of tariffs that we have on the table that we can launch towards the U.S. We have to run through every tariff and minimize the pain for Canadians, maximize the pain for Americans. And I feel terrible for the Americans, but it's one person, it's President Trump, that's creating this chaos.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre delayed his rally in Quebec on Wednesday to give a statement on the auto tariffs. Mr. Poilievre said he wanted to speak directly to the workers.
Before I go any further about these unjustified tariffs and how we're going to respond to them, let me speak to the workers in the auto sector. You're afraid right now. You're anxious. You wonder how you're going to pay your mortgage or put food on the table. You're thinking about the conversations you may need to have with your little children about whether they can register for next year's hockey or this summer's soccer. You don't know if you'll be able to stay in the same city or what's going to happen to your future. Canada will be there for you. We will be there for you. We will ensure that you have income replacement to put food on the table and money in your bank account. We'll make sure that businesses directly affected will have the liquidity they need to get through this dispute. And we will unite as Canadians to protect our affected sectors. But more than that, we need to become strong, self-reliant, sovereign, so that we can stand on our own 2 feet and stand up to the Americans.
Mr. Poilievre said that Canada needs to target American products the country doesn't need or can get elsewhere with retaliatory measures, and that it needs to pressure U.S. officials to make Trump reverse course.
We need to take drastic action to build an economic fortress in Canada, able to reach other markets around the world, repealing the anti-pipeline law, rapidly building LNG liquefaction plants, mines, factories, expanding and making our ports functional so that we can move our goods to other places around the world, knocking down the barriers between our provinces so that we can trade with ourselves for a change, passing a bring it home tax cut on work, investment, home building, and energy to make this the best place in the world to bring back the $500 billion that Liberals pushed out of the country over the last decade. Then and only then will we be able to properly stand up to the Americans and stand up for ourselves. Now is not a time for weakness. Now is not a time to continue on with the failures that got us into this place of dependency. Now is the time to take back control and relaunch our economy so that we can confront the president's unjustified threats and tariffs in a position of strength. We will do this for our people, for our land, for our home, for Canada first, for a change.
Speaking in London, Ontario, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said that Mr. Carney should have announced more widespread countermeasures in the trade war with the U.S. ahead of calling the election on Sunday.
I grew up in Windsor, and Windsor is the automotive capital of this country. I knew what it was like when workers lost their jobs during the ups and downs of the economy. Right now, what Trump has done is a full frontal attack on auto workers. There are hundreds and thousands of workers right now that are wondering if their line is going to shut down and if they're going to lose their job. These workers are wondering if they lose their jobs, how are they going to pay their bills? How are they going to keep their home? How are they going to keep food on the table for their families? This is a direct attack on our workers, and we've got to fight back like hell. We got to fight back with retaliatory tariffs to get rid of these tariffs that are hurting not just jobs in Canada, but jobs in the States as well. And we also have to worry about these workers. The government's got to step up and make sure that none of these workers lose their homes, that these workers can pay their bills, that these workers can get EI, that it's there for them so they can keep food on the table. That's what I'm thinking about right now. We got to fight back. We got to protect these workers. This is a direct attack on so many workers, and we know that Trump is an arsonist. He's literally burning down his own country's jobs and economy and ours as well. And we got to stand up and fight back. This is why I had called on Mark Carney to put in place protections for workers before going to an election. This is not a game. This is serious. Workers right now are wondering how they're going to make ends meet because right now EI does not cover enough to pay the bills. It doesn't cover enough workers, but the amount that you get in income replacement is about 55% of your salary. For a lot of workers, that's not enough to cover the bills. It's not enough to cover the mortgage and to buy groceries and to pay your bills. That's why I said that Mark Carney should have put in place protections for workers before going to an election, knowing these threats were there, knowing that there was threats to directly impact workers and workers could lose their jobs. I said, let's put in place supports first and then go to an election.
Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet stopped to answer questions from journalists on Donald Trump's auto sector tariffs announcement.
I will wait to see until I see what Mr. Trump actually says. I did think the same thing when Mr. Carney says that he would, not will, he would inject a not so important amount of money, $2 billion in that industry throughout Canada is not so much. Liberals should have thought about it before Autobus Lyon died. But I will wait for Mr. Trump to make his announcement. I'm sure the big car makers are presently calling the White House saying, please don't do that. And Mr. Trump is the kind of guy that will say, oh, this man is not my friend. I will add tariff. Let's wait and see what the show is all about.
He also said that it's not surprising that Mr. Carney wants to call Trump, since Mr. Carney is still prime minister, albeit in a caretaker mode, while adding that the surprise is that Mr. Carney has not done so yet. Mr. Blanchet said that any industry in Quebec or Canada deserves help and support. Coming up, Pierre Poilievre announces changes that a Conservative government would make to Canada's tax-free savings account program.
Introducing the Canada First TFSA Top-Up. A common-sense Conservative government will let Canadians contribute an extra $5,000 to tax-free savings accounts for investments in Canadian companies. Here's how it would work.
We'll have this story and more news right after the break. This morning, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre announced that a Conservative government will make changes to Canada's tax-free savings account program, with an additional $5,000 in contributions allowed for investments in Canada.
Introducing the Canada First TFSA Top-Up. A common-sense Conservative government will let Canadians contribute an extra $5,000 to tax-free savings accounts for investments in Canadian companies. Here's how it would work. Nothing about your existing TFSA would change. You would still get your normal $7,000 limit, which you can contribute and invest anywhere and however you like. What would change is that you could contribute an additional $5,000 a year as long as that $5,000 gets invested back into Canada, supporting Canadian companies that employ Canadian workers and pay Canadian taxes. The tax system already defines these kinds of Canadian investments, and my government will create a definition that will let financial institutions and advisors tell you which investments can go into your Canada First TFSA top-up. It will bring home billions of dollars of investment and jobs to Canada, while bringing home savings for you. Money will rush into Canadian businesses, who will in turn hire more people and pay more taxes, and it will help us become more self-reliant and sovereign as we stand on our own 2 feet and stand up to the Americans.
News research by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce says that San Antonio, Detroit, and Kansas City are the 3 American cities most vulnerable to a trade war. The research looked at 41 cities in the U.S. to determine which ones are the most dependent on trade with Canada. The report says that U.S. cities that are heavily tied to trade with Canada and Mexico face significant economic risks from tariffs placed on U.S. goods in response to Donald Trump's trade war. Research released by the Chamber in February indicated that Calgary, St. John, and Windsor are the Canadian cities that would be hit the hardest by U.S. tariffs. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is defending her plan to fly to Florida to appear in an event alongside a conservative U.S. influencer, saying that it is her duty to do everything she can to reach out to Americans to prevent tariffs. In a fiery exchange in the House, Ms. Smith said that she will not be silent.
And I am now off to the U.S. yet again to try and speak to Americans, this time through the second largest podcaster in the world, whose audience is made up of exactly the people we need to persuade to convince their president to change course on tariffs against Canada. And what does Team Carney want me to do? They want me to abandon my post, remain in Alberta, and do absolutely nothing to defend our province. They want me to cower in the face of Eastern media pundits and politicians who favor political grandstanding to effective diplomacy. I'm fiercely criticized for going into the lion's den to change the hearts and minds of the very Americans that we need on Canada's side to avoid a trade war with the most powerful economy on earth. They want this lady and Alberta to just sit down and shut up. Well, here is my response to that. I will not be silent. Alberta will not be silent. We will not be pushed around and called traitors for merely having the courage to actually do something about our nation's and province's predicament other than merely indulging in self-righteous tantrums. And I, for one, will never be silenced by the party in Ottawa that has sold out our beloved province for the last 10 years with the help of their NDP collaborators.
Saskatchewan's premier says the province is reducing the industrial carbon levy to zero. In a video posted on X, Scott Moe says the move is meant to make local businesses more competitive in the face of U.S. imposed tariffs.
Saskatchewan is now a carbon tax-free province, the first carbon tax-free province in Canada. Now that the 2 major federal parties and their leaders have announced their plans for removing the carbon tax, Saskatchewan is taking the next step by reducing the industrial carbon tax rate charged in our province to zero. to give our consumers a break and to make our industries more competitive in this new tariff environment. So what does this mean for you? Well, the immediate effect is the removal of the carbon tax on your Sask power bills, saving Saskatchewan families and small businesses hundreds of dollars a year. And in the longer term, it will reduce the cost of other consumer products that have the industrial carbon tax built right into their price. Saskatchewan is producing some of the most sustainable products in the world today. We want to create the environment to produce more of those sustainable products, to make our industries more competitive in the face of U.S. and Chinese tariffs, and to protect and create Canadian jobs right here in Saskatchewan. Making Saskatchewan a carbon tax-free province will do just that. And I would hope that all of the parties running in the federal election would agree with those objectives and allow the provinces to regulate in this area without imposing the federal backstop.
U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth addressed the fallout from the leaked Signal group chat that included himself and other senior intelligence and national security officials. The secretary delivered brief remarks to the press in Hawaii as he departed for a trip to the Indo-Pacific region. He said that the chat was a team update.
Nobody's texting war plans. Well, I noticed this morning out came something that doesn't look like war plans. And as a matter of fact, they even changed the title to attack plans because they know it's not war plans. There's no units, no locations, no routes, no flight paths, no sources, no methods, no classified information. You know who sees war plans? I see them every single day. I looked at them this morning. I looked at attack plans this morning. You know who does attack plans and war plans? Men like that admiral right there, Paparo, for the Indo-Pacific, or Eric Kurilla, our general in CENTCOM. They do attack plans and war plans. And thank God we have those leaders who do it and do it well, and our enemies know it. My job, as it said atop of that, everybody's seen it now, team update, is to provide updates in real time.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt insisted that the affair was a big hoax and showed that Democrats and their spin in mainstream media know how to fabricate and orchestrate a misinformation campaign quite well. She also attacked the integrity of Atlantic editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg, who was mistakenly added to the chat among senior officials.
For our country, this administration is working hard on behalf of the American public every day, but the mainstream media continues to be focused on a sensationalized story from the failing Atlantic magazine that is falling apart by the hour. Here are the facts. The National Security Advisor has taken responsibility for this matter, and the National Security Council immediately said, alongside the White House counsel's office, that they are looking into how a reporter's number was inadvertently added to this messaging thread. We have said all along that no classified material was sent on this messaging thread. There were no locations, no sources or methods revealed, and there were certainly no war plans discussed. The Atlantic has even admitted this themselves. Their release of these internal messages validates the truth, which we have been saying all along. If this story proves anything, it proves that Democrats and their propagandists in the mainstream media know how to fabricate, orchestrate, and disseminate a misinformation campaign quite well. And there's arguably no one in the media who loves manufacturing and pushing hoaxes more than Jeffrey Goldberg. Goldberg is an anti-Trump hater. He is a registered Democrat. Goldberg's wife is also a registered Democrat and a big Democrat donor who used to work under who? Hillary Clinton.
U.S. Republican House Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene lashed out at a UK journalist during a press conference on Wednesday, telling her to go back to the UK after being questioned about the so-called Signalgate controversy.
Yep. Anybody else?
Should the defense secretary?
What country are you? Wait, what country are you from?
From the UK.
Okay, we don't give a crap about your opinion and your reporting. Why don't you go back to your country where you have a major migrant problem?
Okay,
and you, no. You should care about your own borders.
Do you care about American lives being put at risk?
Let me tell you something. Do you care about people from your country? What about all the women that are raped by migrants?
Do you care
No,
about
by migrants. No, do you care? Okay, you're done.
Do you care about American lives being put at risk?
You know what? I don't care.
Service members fighting for your country.
I don't care about your fake news. Do you have a relevant question? Yeah, this is an American journalist. Thank you.
I'm an American, and I'd like to hear your answer to what she's asking.
I'm not answering her question
right,
because I don't care about her network. If you would like to ask, I can answer.
Do you have any concerns whatsoever about the complete disregard of operational security from the top level of this administration?
You want to know about complete disregard about operational security? You should talk about the Biden administration, how they ripped our borders open to terrorists, cartel, child sex trafficking, human trafficking, and drug trafficking across our borders for 4 years. The Trump administration is doing a great job, and I stand by their statements. I stand by their statements. My comment to you is I'm thankful to President Trump that he is leading us out of wars, that he's ending the war in Ukraine, where American lives could have been killed if Joe Biden was still president today, whether he liked it or not. We're talking about NPR and PBS today. We're talking about fake news that was funded with federal funding from American taxpayers. That's what this is about today, not journalists from the UK that should care about their...
A journalist is being vilified for...
The heated exchange occurred when Sky News reporter Martha Kellner attempted to press green on the implications of senior Trump administration officials using a messaging app to discuss a military strike. Up next, we'll be speaking with Timur Durrani from the Globe and Mail about Jeremy Skibicki's fourth victim, who has finally been identified.
Buffalo women. And now, as we know, Ashley Shingus, the judge made it a big point to say in his last few words that every single day when the women's...
Stay with us. We'll be right back after this. After years of police investigation and community anguish, investigators say they've identified the lone unknown victim of a Winnipeg serial killer as Ashley Christine Shingus, a missing woman from St. Teresa Point, Anishinaabe Nation, who was last seen in downtown Winnipeg in March of 2022. Wednesday's emotional news conference was held at the Millennium Library in downtown Winnipeg, where a number of symbolic items that were in the courtroom during the trial of the man convicted of killing her and 3 other women were also present, including a buffalo headdress.
It is profound. It signifies our history in the ongoing struggle for justice for everybody, especially our young women, our women. Some are still out there missing. Ashley Shingus represented not only an individual whose life was taken too soon, but also the countless Indigenous women who have gone missing, or have been murdered without proper investigation, accountability, or closure for their families. It's a painful story that we have experienced. A painful reminder of the injustices faced by our Indigenous women, from the family, the parents. They couldn't be here, so they sent this message, and it states, this is from the mother, Teresa Shingus. She says, please start the search as soon as possible. It's been a long time waiting. I need to bring her home.
Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew promised at the news conference that there will be a search for Ms. Shingus's remains, and later sang a traditional song for Ms. Shingus at the request of her father, one that a government spokesperson said he previously sang for families of the other victims.
Ashley Shingus Kijinakazo. Ashley Shingus Kijinakazo. Ashley Shingus Kijinakazo. Ashley Shingus Kijinakazo. I think it's very important that we say her name. And we remember her. To the chiefs of the First Nations and to the chiefs of the Winnipeg Police Service, I offer you a warm and hearty handshake and welcome you to work together on bringing Ashley home. I want to say to Ashley's parents, to her mom and dad, who I had a chance to speak with briefly yesterday, I promise you that we are going to search the Brady landfill for your daughter. I cannot promise you that we will bring her home, but I can promise you that we are going to try.
We're now joined by Timur Durrani, a reporter with the Globe and Mail, to unpack this further. Timur, thank you for the time today.
Thank you for having me again.
Now, how were the police able to finally identify that Buffalo woman was Ashley Shingus?
Yeah, so they actually took some DNA that they'd found in and around the serial killer's building. And at the time, they weren't able to identify this back in 2022. They took multiple swabs from Ms. Shingus's family. In fact, actually, they found 16 pieces of different women's DNA in and around his building. 9 of those were never able to be identified properly because they were not in the police's system. Ms. Shingus was in the police's system, but they didn't feel that that was actually corroborating with the evidence of what they'd had that could point to what was still known as Buffalo Woman, the woman who was still known as that, this spirit name that was given to her. At this point now, in December, the police, what they've done is they've talked again to Mr. Skibecki, the serial killer, and you know, they have asked him again about what is it that they could point to, certain new evidence. Through that, they found a pair of black pants that was part of this DNA that they'd seized, and they in fact then to put it to testing again earlier this month. In fact, even again, another DNA analysis earlier this week. Both these new pieces of analysis have pointed them to say definitively now that this is in fact Buffalo Woman, and Miss Shingus is Buffalo Woman.
And in yesterday's news conference, a chief read a letter from Ashley's family, who couldn't be in attendance, that they wanted to search for her remains as soon as possible. How important is it for the family to finally get that closure and be one step closer to bringing Ashley home?
Yeah, you know, I interviewed both Teresa and Albert, the parents of Ashley Shingus, and last night when they talked to us, they were still not able to fly out to Winnipeg for this. They live in a very remote fly-in community in St. Teresa Point, and so they couldn't be here for that. For them, this has been something they've asked the police to do from the beginning. To them, they've always felt that Buffalo Woman was Ashley Shingus. They thought she was connected to these killings. They thought this was the same woman because she went missing in and around the same time that Buffalo Woman was killed, according to the trial. In fact, their belief was so strong that the trial that, you know, I was there every single day, they actually were there. They were there during the 2 biggest moments. So they were there for the guilty plea, you know, when he was put in for that. They were also there for the sentencing. You know, and in both of these instances, even when the verdict came out, they flew out because they believed so strongly that she was Buffalo Woman. In fact, they've been asking police over and over again to conduct this in a more thorough way, to be able to analyze this evidence in a more thorough way and point to who is Buffalo Woman. It really is the other women's families. It's, you know, Mercedes Myron's family, it's Morgan Harris's family, it's Rebecca Contois' family that have constantly not forgotten Buffalo Woman. And now, as we know, Ashley Shingus. You know, the judge made it a big point to say in his last few words that every single day when the women's families were there throughout that very long, months-long trial, they were also there not representing their own families, but also to represent Buffalo Woman. That was something the judge felt was very important and poignant for that trial. But it wasn't just during the trial, even during every single one of these protests that the women's families have done in Ottawa, you know, in the Manitoba legislature, even in Montreal, where they flew out for these protests. They have constantly brought up Buffalo Woman because she's a harbinger of this. You know, she's really a symbol in some ways of how many other missing and murdered Indigenous women are out there who don't have an identity.
Well, in a press conference today, Ashley's dad spoke on the need to search for the landfill because no one should be buried in a landfill. He said, quote, "We aren't garbage." Do you think that when he referred to we, he was referring to the Indigenous community and the relevance of Canada making this community feel comparable to garbage.
That's in fact exactly it, right? Later in that same press conference this morning, we also heard from Thelma Morrisseau, who was one of the women who had in fact been part of the naming ceremony for Mashko de Bishikikwe, which is Buffalo Woman in Anishinaabe. Part of that was to reclaim that identity. Part of that was always to give her the dignity of any other human being who would have an identity, right? And this has been from the beginning. This whole case has been symbolic of this big crisis that we're facing as a country where Indigenous people are not treated, especially Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, are not treated as any other person who deserves the same rights as them. And so that's what we're seeing with this case. The families are now asking that when you go looking for these women, and in this case, when you go looking for Ashley Shingus now, it's important not to just to give closure for her, but it's also important for what you're saying to the rest of the country, that these are also the same level of a human being that any other woman or any other person might be.
And has the federal government vocalized the idea of implementing any sort of change to better protect this community following this case?
They've offered some, part of the funding for the other two women's search, which of course is now we're seeing quite successful. We've in fact been able to identify their human remains earlier this month. You and I spoke for that, right, on your show. And it's important for the federal funding that's gone towards that search. They're funding $20 million out of that $40 million search. It's been successful for that part. So their involvement in this case from the beginning was always hinged on who was in the provincial government, right? Now we have a premier here who is willing to do these things. At the time, we did not have a premier who was willing to do these things. But they've also done other things. There's a red dress alert thing. There's so many other things they're putting out there. How successful those are, though, are yet to be seen. At this point, I think we're really, Premier Wapkunu, who's given me several interviews throughout the course of this, and every time he's brought up the idea that when we keep talking about this, we're also eliminating that bias that as a country we have against Indigenous people, and especially women and Two-Spirit people and girls. And, that's really what this case is highlighting. Hopefully that all of us, as we keep talking about these things, that they're wrong and they're happening in the modern day, that eliminates something like this ever happening again.
Timur, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, stay with us. Coming up after the break, we speak to one of the researchers that has found a new case of antibiotics that can effectively fight superbugs.
So in the right lab, and also as a PhD, like when I did my PhD in India, so I've been doing this work just isolating.
For the first time in decades, researchers have found a new class of antibiotics that could effectively fight superbugs, which are some of the planet's most drug-resistant bacteria. One of the researchers responsible for the discovery joined us earlier for more.
We have all these new breakthrough antibiotics just lying in our soil right under our feet. So in the right lab, and also as a PhD, like when I did my PhD in India, so I've been doing this work just isolating these microbes, these bacteria from the soil, and then just harnessing the power of microbes in terms of what kind of molecules they make. So we extract these molecules from these bacteria, and then we test them against the pathogenic bacteria if it can kill some of the pathogenic strains or not. So that's what we did in this story. So we got the soil samples from our lab manager's backyard soil in Hamilton, and then we brought the soil back to the lab, and then same thing we did. We isolated around 100 bacteria from this soil sample, and then we tested this bacteria if any of them is making something new or something useful for us. So then luckily we found this one bacterium that we are calling Penibacillus. It's a group of bacteria that live in soil. You can find it anywhere in Hamilton or even in a different country. It's a common soil organism. So this bacterium was producing something new. And then when we found out it's a new antibiotic, it has not been reported before. And the way it kills other bacteria, so that was stunning. When we found out these things, it was amazing. It was a satisfying moment at that time.
We also asked how exactly this new antibiotic combats drug-resistant bacteria and superbugs.
So lyricidin, first I'll tell you how it looks. So you might have heard the word the lasso rope that cowboys use to capture animals. So they have the slip knot like structure, like the rope. So this lyricidin, it has exactly the same shape. It's like a lasso. So it's like a string of like amino acids, and they like the few amino acids, they make like a ring, and this string is like threaded through this ring, giving this a slip knot like three-dimensional structure. So the way it gets in the bacterial cell in order to attack on its target, and the target is the protein synthesis machinery in the bacteria. So we call it ribosome. But the way it gets in the cell, that's like very common in bacteria. So it uses like a common mechanism to get in the cell, and the ribosome, we know the protein synthesis machinery, that's common in like all cells. Even like human cells, we have this machinery. But what makes it different that it has minimum impact on the human protein synthesis machinery. So that's why it's specific to bacteria. And moreover, it only attacks the bacteria that needs oxygen to grow. For example, if you look at our gut microbes, they are mainly anaerobic. They don't need oxygen. So the one good thing about lysocidin is it has minimum effect on the gut microbiome. So it only attacks the pathogens.
And lastly, we discussed what is needed to be able to use this antibiotic on humans.
That's a great question. So what we have done so far is just the discovery of like a new antibiotic. So it's just a proof of concept that yes, we can have something, just a starting point. Now the real hard work begins. Now we have to turn this into a real drug. So that's where we need a lot of resources, a lot of efforts and energy, and also a lot of time. It might take up to a decade or more. So that's the real thing begins now. So we are modifying this antibiotic now, its chemical structure, so we can improve its chemical properties and we can make it a better and more potent drug. We know that there are some superbugs that have like gained antibiotic resistance to even our last resort weapons that we use to kill them. So we call them the gram-negative bacteria. For example, E. coli, Acinetobacter baumannii, like Klebsiella pneumoniae. So all these bugs, they infect your lungs. They also, in fact, they go to bloodstream and they cause sepsis, and they also cause like urinary tract infections. So we are targeting these bacteria, which are like on the top of the list of World Health Organization's critical priority pathogens list.
Prime Minister Keir Starmer has accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of making hollow promises on a ceasefire in Ukraine. The Prime Minister co-hosted a summit of allies in Paris to present plans devised by senior military chiefs that seek to deter future Russian aggression against Ukraine, including potentially posting troops there. Speaking alongside Mr. Zelensky after the meeting, Mr. Starmer said the allies had offered Ukraine their full support, quote, for as long as it takes.
We've just had a very constructive meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, bigger than we've had before, 30 countries, plus of course NATO and the EU, and absolutely determined to see peace through strength. There was absolute clarity that Russia is trying to delay, is playing games, and we have to be absolutely clear about that. And that has meant three outcomes. Firstly, more support for Ukraine to make sure Ukraine is in the strongest possible position, both now and in further negotiations. Second, complete clarity that now is not the time for lifting of sanctions. Quite the contrary, what we discussed is how we can increase sanctions to support the US initiative to bring Russia to the table through further pressure from this group of countries. And of course we discussed further the plans for reassuring the peace, the Coalition of the Willing and the military and operational plans, whether they're on the land, the air or the sea. But there was very strong support, and what came out most strongly from the meeting was so many countries standing, as they've stood for over 3 years now with Ukraine, standing in this crucial moment for as long as it takes.
Thousands of Palestinians marched in northern Gaza on Wednesday in the second day of anti-war protests. It's a rare display of public anger against Hamas, although the protests appear generally aimed against the war in Gaza and their insufferable living conditions. Israel has cut off all food, fuel, medicine, and other supplies to war-torn Gaza's roughly 2 million people since the start of the month, a strategy that rights groups say is a war crime. Israel has vowed to increase military pressure until Hamas returns the remaining 59 hostages, 24 of whom are believed to be alive. Marvel unveiled the star-studded cast for Avengers Doomsday during a live stream event on Wednesday, with each actor being revealed one at a time with a glimpse at the back of their director's chair. Some of the biggest and most anticipated names were not among the 27 names announced, though Marvel and Disney could be sitting on them for now. The cast list indicates that Doomsday, which is now in production and arrives next year, will be an ambitious crossover between Marvel's Avengers franchise and the X-Men series, with numerous original X-Men stars returning to reprise their roles. The lights dimmed, the arena fell silent, and a sport took a collective breath. On Wednesday night at TD Garden, the World Figure Skating Championships paused between events for a solemn tribute to the 28 members of the skating community who died in January when American Eagle Flight 5342 crashed into the Potomac River.
Even as we remember the amazing people from the figure skating community that we lost, we take extra care to lift up the young skaters that are still here. They're hurting. I hope we can support them in their skating journeys. Some accidents are unavoidable. This one was not. But rather than looking for places to place blame, I hope that we can work with our elected officials to make air travel safer for everyone and for all of our families. Thank you.
The flight had lifted off from a wintry runway in southeast Kansas, carrying dozens of young skaters, their coaches, and parents who had just attended a U.S. figure skating development camp following nationals. On final approach to Washington, D.C., the regional jet collided with a military helicopter, killing all 67 people aboard. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles. Good night, Canada.